Mining Weekly Online is talking to Dion Friedman, the Director Forensic of KPMG. I think we both agree that mining is an essential pursuit on this continent. But unfortunately, it's all too often that we hear of these inhibiting factors, not the least of them being corruption. And how do we deal with that?
Yeah, I think perhaps it's necessary that we first just set the scene as to why we say mining is important. I think it's generally accepted that Africa's people is its asset of the future, and the question is, where is the money going to come from to develop the asset? And naturally, the continent has been blessed with an abundance of minerals, and that clearly is going to have to fund that. Now, you have to extract it, and you have to be able to turn it or monetize the resource. And clearly we think that the extractive industry is therefore important, and of course the banking industry, but we're not talking about the banking industry today. We talk about the extractive industries. Over time we realized that one of the big inhibiting factors is corruption. It's been one of the oldest crimes in the world, depending on how you look at life and what your expectation of the values and the ethics of different cultures are. But generally we find that corruption inhibits the conversion of the resource into value.
So what do we do about this? How do we manage corruption or eliminate corruption?
Well, there are various initiatives that's normally followed, and they take place at various levels. And I think at a broad global level you find these intergovernmental or inter-country agencies who attempts to conjure up a general view on fighting corruption. Of course, that needs to be filtered down into various governments, other companies, other participants in the economy. Then, of course, you have it at government level and you have it at company level. But what we found is that you can have the G20, for instance, discussing the combating of corruption, having general plans or guidance in place on how to deal with it. But if you don't have participation from the governments themselves, then nothing will happen. And of course, they don't have legislative power or coercive powers to convince the government to participate. When we look at it one level down, you will find that the government may have a good stance or strong stance against corruption and want to filter it down into its administration. But down at ground level, that does not happen. And we see the same thing in a company. A company board has a strong policy, they have legislation to follow, strong views, they come out strongly against corruption. But when the driver arrives at the border post and he's being held up there and a bribe is demanded, what do? Then whatever happens at board level does not necessarily be reflected in the actions on the ground. And I call this a big disconnect between very often what we say and what happens in the real world.
And how can we bring those two together and create a connection so that what is said on top actually does take place at ground level?
If one just take one step back and we look at it more from a fundamental point of view. A wise man once told me that we were having a debate about South Africa and whether education or healthcare is the most important part of what needs to be fixed and uplifted. I argued that we have to sort both out. This gentleman said, if you are educated, you will look after your own health. And I want to take that point further and sort of transpose it into this conversation and say, if we educate people around it, that at a broad level would be your first line of defense. We can talk about processes, we can do transaction testing, we can have legislation in place. The FCPA in the United States has been in place since the 1970s. But it has never been applied until probably about 5-6 years ago when the DOJ became very aggressive. Suddenly when they applied it, there was a lot of companies coughing up, admitting to having transgressed the FCPA and paying disgorgements. Does that kill corruption? No. It just puts a regulatory framework which is being enforced. And that's perhaps the second point in addition to education. When we institutionalize our values, it becomes public first of all, and secondly, there becomes a firm or legislated view of what our values are. When we have that, it guides the conduct of people. So education on the one hand at a broad level, I think, is a powerful tool, and when we institutionalize our values. Then of course following on that you have, looking at processes. Are our processes such that it prevents or mitigates the risk of corruption? We can take it down to a transaction-based level where we say we will be looking at our transactions and determine whether our organization is engaging in corruption and so forth. But it's a range of measures that needs to be taken.
And isn't fear one of them? I mean, I see all sorts of legislation coming through in various developed world countries, putting the fear of hell into any executive who dares engage in corruption. And doesn't this filter down?
Fear is normally a good motivator. But my question would be, would it be a motivator for compliance with legislation? Or is it a motivator towards changing culture?
So we need to actually change the culture.
Culture needs to be changed. Culture needs to be changed, but culture is always, or more often than not, a very relative concept. Because what you may think is good and right is not necessarily what I may think is good and right. And when we're from different cultures, different countries, different backgrounds, that divide becomes bigger.
And, for instance, I'm told that some of these officials engaged in Africa don't really get regular pay. So they look to their position to try and get some funding out of the visitors. And this is also, as you say, the culture is a huge issue.
Well, it's like, I think it's a combination of lack of money, resources on the part of an official, and the old adage of Lord Acton that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now clearly if an official sits at a border post and haven't been paid, and somebody comes across the border post to import something, let's say it's a customs official, that official has certain powers vis-a-vis the import that needs to take place. And on the back of that, this official says, well, I haven't been paid. That's perhaps a more powerful motivating factor for committing an offence like bribery and corruption than the fear that something may happen if you don't. And again, that typically happens in an environment which is far removed from a fairly transparent environment. There's less transparency at a remote border post than in the city.
And we hear a lot about corruption, but the issue of extortion, does this also not play a role at border posts?
Well, that's an interesting comment you make there, Martin. I think whenever the discretionary, and I refer to the discretionary environment as an environment which is fostering the mix of ingredients that you need to find corrupt relationships. So whenever we talk of that environment, the first thing that comes up is always corruption. And it is let's call it the offence or the crime that more often than not is mostly dealt with. It's considered globally to be one of the big issues that needs to be dealt with. It's considered as the biggest inhibitor to development, and there's a number of things that it inhibits. Let's look at an example. I arrive at a border post. I want to import a container. And I know that there's something in the container that the customs official would have an interest in. He or she suspects the same thing. In order to make this thing go through smoothly, we agree that I would be giving some benefit to the customs official, and that's your classic corruption scenario. When I arrive at the border post and my container is clean, there should not be an issue. But the customs official, like in the instance that you mentioned earlier, hasn't been paid last month, needs to generate something. They have the powers, and they can probably, by abuse of those powers, retain or seize my container and put me in a position where the value that I need to disgorge to the customs officer, although it would reduce the margin on the value of my container, would be such that I would be willing to pay it. Because if I don't get my container in, and there's reputation risk in addition to the financial knock that you're going to take if you don't get the container in, which comes into play. So that really is a classic extortion scenario. And in many cases, and whether you look at, if we pull it back to the mining world, whether we look at the environment where an investor would be establishing a mine in a country, there's probably lots of opportunity for extortion. You want to obtain the rights to mine. There's a number of bodies, including government bodies, that need to be involved in that process. And the delay of that process is costing you money. Remember, we're throwing R1 billion into the pit that we spoke of earlier. That R1 billion is being financed more often than not. Or if it's not financed, there's opportunity cost to it that needs to be financed. And the longer that delay goes on in a process, the more you become susceptible, I think, to be paying an amount over to get the process moving forward. Now, often we say that's corruption, but in the background there's this extortive element to it. And I don't think that we pay enough attention to that when we talk about the mining world in Africa, or if we sort of decouple it from Africa, but in this discretionary environment where we often put up mines.
And what can we do about this? I always like some solution to be on the horizon. How do we deal with these things?
The simple advice is always don't pay it. But it, unfortunately, in the real world, it's easier said than done. My view on if we talk, let's sort of decouple the argument from the broader perspective and get down to what needs to be done in practice. We found with our clients that when they are able to have good insight into the environment where they have to operate in, particularly when it is a discretionary environment, good insight into what is to be expected enables them to make better decisions. Once you are able to make the better decision, you can manage the potential risk that is lying out there. And that requires you to do a proper inquiry. What is it that I can expect there? Who are the players? What are they doing? What are their propensities? Are we able to anticipate that and react accordingly? You want to have a better plan when you go into an environment like that. And I think that gives you the best opportunity to mitigate the risk of it happening. You will never be able to eradicate the risk of it happening. Of course, development. It's not only a criminal problem, it's a social problem that's sitting in the back of it as well. So one would expect that when development has taken place in a discretionary environment, it goes with the education that we spoke of earlier. the added concept of values being institutionalized, that reduces that risk where you operate. But when you're building a mine, you don't have the benefit of saying, I want to build a mine in the middle of New York. And I think that's the reality. So knowing what to expect and being able to plan accordingly and mitigate the risks before they happen is the best solution for that.
Mining Weekly Online has been in conversation with Dion Friedman, the Director Forensic of KPMG.